You're with the Sound of Ideas from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thank you for staying with us. When the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan to bring about the end of World War II, the initial reaction was one of awe and even celebrating success. The U.S. government painted the atomic weapons as simply larger versions of traditional bombs, with nothing being said of the long lasting dangers of radiation. The military controlled the narrative around the bombings as much as they could until a few reporters started to dig deeper, documenting the horrors of what was happening in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Not just the complete destruction of the cities, but the radiation burns, peeling skin, and tens of thousands of deaths mounting in the weeks and months after the bombs were dropped. The new documentary, Bombshell, examines the propaganda around the use of the nuclear bombs and how journalists covered the fallout in the years after the war. One of those reporters was Charles Loeb, a Black reporter based here in Cleveland. With me now to talk more about Bombshell is Ben Lauderman, the writer and director of the film. Ben, welcome to the Sound of Ideas. We believe we have Ben on the line. We'll make sure that that connection is solid. We also have Dr. Felicia Ross with us. She's an associate professor in the School of Communication at The Ohio State University. She's featured in the documentary, often discussing Charles Loeb's journalistic contributions. Felicia, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now, if you would like to join the conversation, you can give us a call at 866-578-0903. You can also email us at soi@ideastream.org. You can also send us a message on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas. And we're going to check again and see if Ben's connection is solid. Ben, are you with us?
I am.
Ben, welcome to the show. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Now, Ben, to give us some context for the time we're talking about and how the press was covering the emerging atomic age, there are writers like William Lawrence who wanted to cover science and the splitting of the atom, but the U.S. government wanted to be careful with how much access the press was given. Can you talk about that secrecy at the time?
Yeah, in the beginning, this was part of warfare, and the U.S. government was afraid that German scientists were developing an atomic bomb. And the feeling in the U.S. was that couldn't happen, and that if atomic bombs were to be developed, they should be developed by America, not Germany. So that's what happened.
And what were the initial thoughts regarding radiation from the U.S. military and how it was discussed with the press?
The thoughts were not much. It was an afterthought because the priority was to have a bomb that worked and was successful. So the idea of radiation, certainly as it applied to people who could be innocent victims or civilian victims, was not concerned at all. The real concern about radiation in the atomic bomb program called the Manhattan Project was that nobody find out about the radiation, including the press.
Now, Ben, the U.S. was using a nuclear weapon, developing a nuclear weapon at a time when there was widespread condemnation of the use of chemical weapons. So, how did people differentiate these two tactics at the time?
Well, that was the key to the U.S. publicity campaign for the atomic bomb. At first, of course, the development of the Manhattan Project was kept very, very, very secret. And the history we tend to look at is about that part of the process. What comes next is just as important, but has been completely overlooked, which is the publicity of the atomic bomb. So that's where the government put its effort.
Felicia, now let's talk about Charles Loeb, who he was, and how he comes into the story. Can you tell us about him as a reporter and what he was covering during the war?
Well, Charles Loeb was an experienced reporter to the extent where the Negro Newspaper Publishers Association selected him to cover at least the Pacific Theater uh, in starting in 1944, and um, and and he Also, in addition to being a journalist, having his journalistic experience, he also had a background in chemistry. He had been a pre-med student, and so he was able to apply his knowledge to what he had heard about the results of the atomic bomb.
So he had science in his background, and that made him particularly interested to qualify and qualified to cover this particular aspect of the war.
Yes, he was able to challenge the um, the line that Ben had noted that there were no radioactive fallout, no radiation sickness as a result of the bomb. He was able to dispute that.
Now, when we talk about how the black press specifically covered World War II, were there certain threads and stories that they looked into that were different than other elements of the media?
They focused on the treatment and the experience of the Black soldiers, as well as the contributions that people on the home front made, the Black community on the home front made toward the war. And so their purpose was to show how loyal the Black community was in supporting the war effort, the U.S. effort, but also at the same time holding the government accountable about to the way they treated Black people. In other words, yes, they want to contribute, they want to do things to support the war effort, but they also want better treatment overall.
Felicia,
And as we looked at the black press, the one thing I noticed was that the reporting was much more personal, much more intimate, much more concerned about the boys from back home, especially in Cleveland, that Charles Loeb went to tell stories about. You didn't see that in the major white press because the war was being covered in newspaper dailies, but the black press was being reported once a week. So the tone and the tenor of the reporting had to be a little bit more reflective and a little bit different because everybody would know by the time they got a black paper once a week that they had read or been exposed to the press that was in the white dailies.
and then we touched on writing of William Lawrence at this time when this was happening. And can you expand on this a bit? You know, William Lawrence was doing some writing about things, but is it fair to say that he was essentially part of the Manhattan Project and therefore not challenging the military?
Oh, yes. I mean, early on, William Lawrence took great pride in being one of the founders of what became the genre of science journalism in newspapers. He was really the first professional daily science journalist and ended up working for the New York Times. But at some point, General Groves, the leader of the Manhattan Project, went personally to New York and asked Lawrence's editor if he could simply borrow Lawrence for a secret project for about 4 months. And there was the question from Groves about what kind of patriot is the New York Times? And of course, the editor said, we are the best kind of patriot, sir. Of course, you can borrow William Lawrence." And that's what happened. He went to work secretly. He got an exclusive. He got all the access, and he wrote whatever he wanted. He just didn't control when it came out or how it was edited or what was said.
Felicia, I want to ask you now about the perception of some of the black press of the atomic bomb being used against, quote, people of color, referring to the Japanese at the time. This was discussed in the documentary quite a bit, that this massive new weapon certainly was not used against a white country. Can you talk to us about that?
Well, you had I guess what we call the Black leaders or the Black intellectuals of the day, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, um, uh, and also Walter White, who was at the time head of the NAACP. You had artists such as Langston Hughes um, uh, questioning the selection of Japan as the place to drop the bomb. And also, the newspapers had a kinship with the Japanese. That not only in terms of the atomic bomb, but also they were critical of the internment camps that they had for Japanese American citizens. So, so by that time, black newspapers had had a global sense of race relations and the like. They connected with people of color throughout the world, and that was the mindset of their skepticism.
And it's funny that it continues to be a point. Our film Bombshell premiered on PBS last week, and so we are just getting the first flurry of comments in about it, and many comments we're reading say, "What do you mean the blacks considered Japanese people of color?" Or the Japanese aren't people of color, are they? So I don't know what Felicia's view is, but I'm surprised at that.
Well, I'm surprised at that as well. I have not seen those comments, but I guess I shouldn't be surprised. But I have not seen those comments that you're referring to. But I am seeing it more when we talk about a little bit more. But when we're talking about the Somali community,
Sure.
and
Thank you for sharing that insight and the reaction that's coming from the documentary, which, as you mentioned, Bombshell from American Experience, is available now on the PBS Passport app. If you're not familiar, I want to remind our audience that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the atomic weapon used by the United States on Japan in World War II, which did lead to the end of World War II, but also the way it was talked about at the time and information that came out after the fact. If you want to be a part of this conversation, the number is 866 578 0903. And the email to send us a thought is soi@ideastream.org. We have an email from Logan in Akron, and Logan writes, multiple government agencies now use atomic bomb survivor data from Hiroshima and Nagasaki to infer risk estimates resulting from exposure to radiation. Logan, thank you for sharing that piece of information with us. Felicia, let's return now to Charles Loeb's reporting in the aftermath of the bombing. Can you talk to us about what kind of articles he was writing then, and did that differ in terms of what was published abroad versus what was published in the United States?
well, I only know what he published in the black newspapers in the United States, and after, and I'm hoping I'm understanding your question, but he it was a variety of different articles, about 33 or so, that he wrote in, I guess, about the 18 months that he was over in Japan, and he so he wrote a lot of things about, as Ben had alluded to, about the experiences of individual black soldiers. He also wrote about the how some of the mistreatment that some of the black military personnel experienced, and he also uh, uh, wrote about the participation of the black press. One of the things he was able to do was he was one of the press members of the press corps who covered the actual surrender of Japan to the United States, and 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 one thing he also did, he personalized it. He used personal pronouns such as we and our, to as though it's a way is bringing the public, or the readers, making them a part of what he was doing. So it was a variety of stories that um, he wrote, some of light types of stories, as well as some of the more serious ones where maybe someone might have been killed, and of course, some of the mistreatment.
Mm.
So American reporters were forced to submit their reports first to the censorship office in
Hmm.
Tokyo of the Allied Command. Foreign reporters were not under that thumb. So there are a couple of foreign reporters like Wilfred Burchett who went to hospitals, wrote about the radiation poisoning he was seeing firsthand, and those headlines went around the world, but somehow they missed America. Americans never read those things and never saw those articles. So what Loeb did was very carefully, very coolly, very calculatedly, I think, he wrote a very sophisticated analysis, but that gave light to what the government was doing. I think, and Felicia will correct me, I think the government just decided that if it appears in the black press, it's not important. Just like
Mm.
if it appears in the foreign press, it's not important if we can keep most Americans from not seeing it. So it wasn't taken with a degree of threat that the mainstream press could have brought but didn't.
Mm. Felicia, does that feel accurate to you, to a description of the treatment at the time?
I, I'm I'm not so sure about that because I know black newspapers had to go through those censors as well, and so I think it was more about the way he wrote the story, where he would say things like our Colonel Stanford Warren, and his his giving the government perspective that a single exposure of a dose of gamma radiation, similar to an X-ray, but then he would also highlight what the Japanese uh, uh, press or the Japanese victims were saying. So he managed to kind of sneak it
Mm.
um, in a way that it could get around those military censors.
Mm. We have a call now from
And,
Todd
and it
in
might be
War.
part of what,
Go ahead,
sorry.
Felicia.
No, I was going to say, and it might be um, a bit of what Ben was saying about them not taking the black press seriously, but um, I think it's more that I know they were looking at examining the black press very seriously
Mm.
in that World War as well as in the First World War.
Okay. We have a call now from Todd in
I'm
Ward
sorry.
1. Todd, welcome to the Sound of Ideas. Go ahead.
Stephanie, Felicia, Ben, I've studied thoroughly 11 previous presidents, Truman being one of them. And in the documentary, could you let me know to what degree does the documentary address what Truman team had to consider and openly considered amongst one another the cost to U.S. troops through conventional warfare loss. You know, if they stayed on the conventional warfare against Japan, how many more troops were they going to continue to lose because Japan's leadership wasn't going to give up? And then balance that with dropping those two bombs. Was that addressed in the documentary? And did the African Americans that you're referencing take that in consideration in any conversation that you read about or saw on video?
Sure. I think what was emphasized in the reporting, but wasn't taken all that seriously, was that at a conference called Potsdam to divide up Europe after the European War ended, which was before the Japanese War did, Truman was very clear and was negotiating with Stalin about how to divide up Europe between East and West, democracy and communism. And Truman did not want to have to do that with Japan. But what he did was he secured from Stalin agreement to come in and have Russian troops invade. So Russian troops were going to be the main invading force, not American troops. And we don't think about that in America.
Mm.
But they were going to swarm into Japan on August 9th. But Truman knew that if this bomb thing could work, that could change the equation before the Russians got in, and he wouldn't have to be in this real estate poker game about Southeast Asia the way he was about dividing Europe.
I see. That's all the time we have for this conversation today, unfortunately. Ben Lauderman, writer and director of Bombshell, thanks for being with us.
Sure, thank you.
And Dr. Felicia Ross from The Ohio State University, featured in the documentary. Thank you for your time, Felicia.
Thank you for having me.
Bombshell from American Experience is now available to stream on demand using the PBS Passport app.